Dickie and her son Kevin Bettie to talk about their long relationship and involvement with our wonderful community. As always, Jerry's here filming, and it will be available eventually on GNet. And it also, the episode will be preserved at the Manchester Historical Society for future generations. So again, thank you so much for coming, and help me welcome Phylis and Kevin.
It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. This is like gathering together in our living room for a visit. And my whole name is Phyliss Adele Hurley Bettie Dickie. I don't have to sign that whole thing when I write a check. Thank you. And my mother's name was Helen Adams. And her father was Harry Adams, for which the park is named right across from the Adams household. The Adams house is right next door to what is now the funeral parlor. So I'm going to start way back with the first member of my family that moved to Manchester from Peru, and his name was Warren Abel Adams. He was my great-grandfather. And he was not married when he first moved over here. He was a very eligible bachelor. And the young ladies in town were quite interested, but he had other ideas. He brought a young lady over from Peru and married her, and her name was Serafina Dunham. And the story was that the people here in town said, well, we don't know what he saw in that Serafina Dunham. All she can do is fiddle and dance. But we know that she was also a good gardener, because from the time I was born there at the Adams house, and I think until the present day, there's still a large asparagus bed that she started, because everybody calls it Serafina's asparagus bed. And she also grew mint. I think do you have any of her mint?
I don't think we do, but I'm not sure.
I transplanted some over on Mountain View Terrace where I live. And so her name comes up quite often. And Warren Abel Adams came over in 1865. That was when he bought the house there next to the funeral parlor. And he was a very active person. They had a nice big room in the front of the house that he made into a shop. And he was called a jeweler. Ted Hopkins helped me do some research on the tools and I have the tools here. Yeah, maybe Kevin should get that out. That they used for repairing clocks. Everybody's pocket watch at that time had jewels in it. So this is called, I believe, shacking or shaking.
So it's like a miniature clock? Like on...
I'll show you what it is. And it's unusual because the glass dome is still in one piece. And in the bottom of the box, Kev, there's a card that Ted gave me to tell me where these were manufactured. In Vermont, which is interesting. See the date there? Late 17th.
1871 to 1891 in Royalton, or Roxbury, Vermont. Sold for $120 at that time.
It was expensive. They were very intricate tools.
And Ted's back there, he can fill in if he knows anything else.
It's a jeweler's stake, and we're putting jewels in a pocket watch. Everybody wore a pocket watch. Even at my age, I always had a pocket watch because wristwatches wouldn't stand the vibration. Today it's worth, I think, $440, something we figured out.
I
That's interesting, how it's increased in value.
I'll hold it up again, but I'm gonna leave the glass
Don't
down
drop the gravel.
there. I almost don't dare touch it.
Manchester Day here.
Took considerable doing to get it freed up, it was froze.
Yes, Ted cleaned it all up, took a lot
Yeah.
of rust off
It's
of
in
it.
top shape now.
And we only recently discovered this, right?
Up in my garage upstairs, and my mother must have brought it over when we moved there
Yeah.
back in the 18, or 9.
So all these
2018.
different bits fit into the tool and then do their thing.
The other thing that they did in that shop at the Adams house was to repair sewing machines. Of course, back in the 1800s, every household had a sewing machine. So that was very important. And Warren Abel Adams and his wife and my maternal grandmother's parents, whose name was Chapman, they all got together and said, we need a Methodist church in Manchester. There was no church for the Methodists at that time. So they were instrumental in getting the Methodist church started. And the Adams family had bought an old schoolhouse that was down somewhere near the center of town that they weren't going to use anymore in Manchester Center. And they moved it on Center Hill Road where the glass glass shop is now. And at that time, they put it parallel to the road. It was a good-sized building. And they put apartments in it, but upstairs they had a meeting room. And a lot of town meetings were held in Adams Hall, as it was called. And I recently found a painting of Adams Hall done by Lester Farnham many years ago. And I donated it to the Historical Society. They now have that in their possession. And Adams Hall, the Methodist Church started in the late 1800s. And they met in Adams Hall in 1869 and for quite a few years after that. And then they finally decided they could get together enough money to build a building, and that's where the funeral home is now. And it was built in 1883. And my grandfather, Warren Abel, was called a lay preacher. He was not the minister for the Methodists, but he was a lay preacher. And he and his daughter, Mary Fina, he had 5 children, my grandfather being one of them. But my grandfather's sister, Mary Fina, played what they called a melodeon. And it was portable. You could fold the legs up, put it on a sleigh or a wagon, and take it over to Peru, where Warren Abel would preach the sermon, and Serafina would play for the hymns. So the family was very, very active in the church for many years, because my mother sang in the choir there, and my grandfather sang in the choir. And it was interesting how my mother's side of the family came to Vermont. Her mother was born out in Ohio, and her name was Adele Chapman. And it just was, we found out recently that she had an aunt down on Richville Road, almost across from the Burton building there, before you get to Union Street. She owned that house. And her husband, who worked in the marble mill up in East Dorset, had recently passed away. So she wrote to her brother out in Ohio and said, if you will come and live with me, I will leave you my house. And they had a daughter, Adele, who was about 19 or 20 years old at that time. And if she had not moved to Manchester, none of us would be here. That was a very important move. So she came, and she was a singer too. So she met Harry's sisters first, and they used to sing at weddings and funerals. And soon they had a real quartet, so my grandfather, who had a wonderful tenor voice, was singing with them. That's how he and Adele got acquainted. She was 3 years older than he was. but they got married anyway. And that church closed in 1940, when I was 12 years old. I was born in 1928. And so the whole Adams Hurley family moved across the road to the Episcopal Church when the Methodist Church closed in 1940. And I, when I was a teenager, became very interested in playing the organ. I had taken piano lessons from the time I was 4, and I started teaching myself to play the pipe organ. And Addie Roberts Overton was my piano teacher. She was also the organist at the Episcopal Church at the time. So I sang in her junior choir first, and then I learned to play the organ and substituted at some of the services. So our whole family loved to sing. My grandfather and my mother and I all sang in choral groups directed by Ralph Howes up at Burton. And by the way, our family, when these boys, one of them just left, when these boys start Burton, it will be the 6th generation of our family to go to Burton. And we're also the 6th generation to be members of the Episcopal Church here.
And almost as many on the Bettie side of the family as well.
At Burton, that's
Yep.
right. Well, why don't you tell them a little bit about the Bettie family?
Okay, if you want me to now, or do you want to finish up what you're talking
Well,
about? Or-
my grandfather was very active in the Manchester band because he loved playing his alto horn, I think it was called. And he was also very helpful to the firemen, Manchester Fire Department, because he kept the books and wrote the checks. I think they received checks. But anyway, that almost brings it up to my father's generation. So you're going to talk some about my father, Roger Hurley,
Mhm.
because you were, I had 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls, and most of them did not become hunters. And they did a little fishing, but not a lot. But you liked hunting and fishing, which my dad loved. So why don't
Okay,
you?
well, that's the connection I'll talk about when I get to that with my grandfather, Roger Hurley. But I'm going to start with the Beatties, and I'd first like to say I'm amazed at how many people I know here, which is pretty nice. And Mike DeBunda, who I had a few entanglements with when he was a cop in Manchester.
He turned out very well.
We don't want to talk about that at all. I grew up not being much of a talker, and so I became a really good listener. And I listened to a lot of stories over the years from my elders and different adults that I had association with. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today was passed on through stories, and I absolutely cannot guarantee any accuracy. Both from, I don't know how accurate the stories are, and my memory may or may not be as good as I think it is. But in any event, I'm going to start with how the Beatties came to be in Manchester. And we have Jessie Forrest here, who's a family member, and she might, I don't know if she might correct me on a few things or not. But as far as I know, my great-grandfather came from the Salem, Cambridge, Sandgate area. And he was, there were a lot of Beatties over there, and there still is, actually. So we know that some family came from there. And he moved out to the Midwest, I think right after the Civil War, like a lot of people did. And went out there with his family. And along about 1880, his wife and 2 sons came back. And I'm not sure that anybody really knows what exactly happened and why they came back to this area. But about 1880, they came back here and they settled on a farmstead in what is now, well, it is part of Land Grove, and it's now part of the National Forest. And they had a farm there with the mother and the 2 sons. And I've been to where the farm was. I've seen the foundations. It was quite a large house for that era. A very large foundation, and the barns were pretty large too. It sits on what's called actually Beatty Road now, which becomes a Class 4 road and goes into the National Forest, and that's where the homestead was. It sat kind of on a hill and had a really nice south-facing view at the time, because it was cleared, of course. Now it's all mature woods. And the barn had, the barn area had extensive stone walls and some pretty fancy stonework there and so forth for other places of that era that I've seen. So it seemed like it was quite an extensive place. So the 2 sons and the mother lived there for about 20 years, and I think during that time my grandfather, Will Bettie, got married when they were still living there, and he married Augusta Bell, who also came from Peru. So we have Peru roots on both sides of the family. And she came from the north into Peru someplace, I'm not sure exactly where. And they proceeded to have children. And they had, I believe it was 8, right? Yeah.
Wow.
They
I
had
think so.
8 kids.
Augusta?
8, yeah. I never knew a lot of those children who would be my uncles, aunts and uncles. I knew a few of them. But they
They
were...
had moved away, a lot of them.
Yeah, a lot of them had grown up and moved away by the time I was around, so I never met some of those aunts and uncles. But about 1900, my grandfather came to Manchester, left that farm and came to Manchester. The farm was sold in Land Grove, and his brother stayed over there. There's a lot of Beatties in around Londonderry, and kind of migrated to Jamaica and Townsend and down that way, that are my grandfather's brother's descendants. So really don't know a lot about them either. But so my grandfather came here, and did they buy what's now the Forest place?
Oh, well, it's not the
They-
forest, it's Erskines on it now, but,
It's called Jamison Farm.
No, I mean where Aunt Midge lived.
yeah, that was,
They purchased, I guess they purchased that
Yeah,
farm.
they-
Because that's where they came to first, was where my Aunt Midge Forrest lived until recently. Many of what I'm going to get to in a minute, what we call the younger family, were born there.
well, the thing is, yeah, the older families, when they had Dougie, her mom passed away, and then Grandma took care of her, and then she married Bill,
Yep,
and then had a whole bunch more.
yep. So that,
Will's first wife and his second wife were sisters.
That's right.
yeah. So Augusta took sick, and Augusta's
Lottie.
sister, Lottie, also known as Bell Bell in Peru, and you could probably think of a lot of reasons why that might be, but I don't know. But that was her nickname in Peru. She came to help with the family, and eventually married my grandfather after Augusta was gone, and they proceeded to have 4 kids. And what was it, 6 or 7 more?
I think there were 17 in all.
There were 17 in all. And I'm never quite sure if that included a son that my grandmother Lottie had from a previous marriage.
I think it included Ernest.
Ernest Jewell. So my grandmother actually got divorced, which was unusual for that time. And came and lived with her sister's family, and then got married and had more kids.
Very prolific.
So at some point, they sold that place and moved across the road. And I don't know why that happened, but
More land with it, I think.
they moved across the road to where, in more recent times, was the Bettie place, and my Uncle Ben ended up farming there in later years. But the place where my Aunt Midge was born is, she was actually born in that house, and then she ended up living there for most of her life, until 105, when she died not too long ago. And she was born, she was very tiny when she was born, and I just have to relay this story. She was, I guess, probably premature, and she only weighed like, what,
2 pounds.
3 or 4 pounds or something?
Yeah, I think I went down 2 pounds. They put
Yeah,
her in a shoebox.
which is quite amazing. They put her in a shoebox and put her in the oven.
And the oven door, they closed it.
I told you I wasn't gonna be totally accurate. But she survived, and she lived to 105, and she lived most of her life in that house. That house, when they moved across the road, was sold to a Jameson. And we have Jamesons on my mom's side of the family.
My sister married a Jameson.
But it's a different family, and it's spelled differently.
Right.
Our Jamesons have an I-E in the middle, and the Jameson that owned that place for a while, it didn't have an I in it. But they were quite a common family in Manchester too, because just up the road here, going up toward the town offices, was known as Jameson Flats at the time, and so they owned quite a lot of property up that way, and including what's now the Forest Farm. Later on, when Aunt Midge grew older, she married Ed Forrest, who was my uncle, and they bought that place back at that time. I don't know exactly when. So that farm went out of the family, then came back into the family on the Forest side. And the Forest actually had a place further out, actually where you live, further out North Road.
Right.
That was the Forest Farm. And two of my aunts married two Forrests that were brothers. Gussie Forrest married a Forrest, and they had a farm up in Paula. So that's how the Betties came to be in Manchester. And there were a lot of them, and most of them, especially the older family, moved to different places, but there's still a few of us around. I think that was what I was going to say about the Bettie family. Unless
Do you
you...
want me to start in a little bit more about my father, and then you can
Sure.
tell about your relationship to him?
Sure.
Roger Hurley was born in Bennington, and he was apparently a very lively youngster and was quite often in trouble in school with his teachers. And finally, when he was in high school, his parents decided they were going to send him to Manchester to live with his uncle Otto Bennett, who owned the Manchester Journal at that time. He was married to my grandmother's sister, Aunt Jessie was her name. And so he came up to live with them because Uncle Otto was known to be a very strict disciplinarian, and that was apparently what my dad needed, so he came with Uncle Otto.
Kind of ran in the family.
And he went to Burton and finally graduated. But he became very close friends with my mother's brother, Warren Adams. And they spent a lot of time together, and my mother was somewhat younger, but as she grew a little older, Roger began to notice her more, and they ended up getting married back in the 1920s. And they lived in an apartment upstairs in the Adams house. My grandparents lived downstairs. And they lived there until I was 8. I was going to school at the Manchester Center School when it was in the parking lot, where the church owns the parking lot now. And so we moved to Richville when I was 8. And you're going to tell a little bit about the Rich Lumber Company that built all those houses later on. So we lived there quite a few years. I was married when I was 19, and that's when I moved out of that house and back into the Adams house. The apartment was available upstairs, so Orrin and I, when we first got married, moved into the little apartment. We were already building our house over on Mountain View Terrace near Tricia's house. And I did go to Millbury College for a very brief time, but I wasn't very interested because I was engaged to Orrin already. And I wanted to raise a family, which we did. We didn't have 17, we only had 5. But I do have 12 grandchildren, and this past Sunday, a few days ago, my 20th great-grandchild was born down near Boston, right on Father's Day. It was a wonderful Father's Day present for my granddaughter's husband. So the family continues to grow. It's a very large family tree. Luckily, my oldest daughter, Lynn, she's a little bit older than Kevin, she was a veterinarian, but she found time to do a lot of studies of our background in our families, and printed up some wonderful books for us. I've got one of them here. It has pictures of all of my grandparents and great-grandparents in it, along with the pedigree. And she kept good records for us. So when we were still living over on Mountain View Terrace, and the children had been in school for quite a few years, the girls kept begging their father to get a couple of ponies for them. Well, those couple of ponies eventually widened into a very large registered Morgan horse farm. So in 1965, we decided we needed a farm. We couldn't keep them right there in the middle of town in back of Cottage Street. So we bought the Taylor farm over in Barnumville and renovated the house and moved over there in 1965. Most of you were in high school, I guess.
That was the year I started.
The year you started high school, okay. And Lynn was ready to go to college, I think, very soon after that. But we were hoping Ivan was going to be able to tell us a little bit more about the Morgan horses, but he's in the haying season. So he can't leave the farm. But his daughter Megan is here. She was brought up there on the Morgan horse farm. And would you like to say a few words about the farm and how it evolved?
Yeah, sure. I think, if I remember correctly, the Morgans were the choice for Papa because they had used some Morgans on the farm, on the Beattie homestead. So he knew about the Morgan horses, which of course is the Vermont state animal. And so the first stallion on the farm was Bald Mountain Ebony Knight that came from the Bald Mountain farm. And Papa was a firm believer that a great breeding program came from the mares.
We have Neil Knapp's wife here.
Oh, great.
The
The Bald Mountain Farm, yeah, that's great. So that was, you played a big role.
I didn't, but my
Your family.
in-laws did.
Yeah, so what started off, I think, is kind of a hobby for the girls and for Papa, not so much the boys. They were into motorcycles and things of that nature. started off as a kind of a gentleman's hobby, quickly turned into a livelihood. My dad had moved to Connecticut as an engineer, and he came back. Papa passed away in '78, and at that time he came back. Well, prior to that, and helped on the farm, and so that's kind of how he acquired that lifestyle of farming. But yeah, so it was Morgan horses because of that, and it just grew. We had cattle as well, and I don't know if you guys are going to talk about any of the cattle
All the
drives. or
beef
things.
cattle, we did have a cattle drive.
Yeah, so it was Morgans and cattle that were on the farm, and it's just Morgans today.
And there are not many buyers for Morgan horses these days, unfortunately. We still have about 50 registered Morgans, and not much of an opportunity to cut down on the size of the herd. And of course, they keep eating and meeting the veterinarians and the farriers for their feed. So it's kind of sad that it's come to that. The Morgan used to be a very versatile horse, and I think some of the wealthier people that bought Morgans decided they wanted them to look more like real show horses, be a little high-strung and more animated, and so they sort of bred for that type of horse rather than the versatile Morgan, which is too bad, I think. So, you want to get back to your days with your grandfather,
Sure.
Roger?
Yep. And before that, I just wanted to say that I mentioned that I may not be very accurate in my storytelling, but I like storytelling because it has a richness to it that maybe goes beyond the need to be totally accurate on things.
Can be embellished.
One of the drawbacks of verbal storytelling is that it may not get passed on. It's not like a permanent record, like a written record. But on the other hand, there are many, many things that I have sat and listened to from older folks that never would get in writing, and I try to remember what I can, but I've probably forgotten 90% of what I've ever heard from adults as I grew up. I wanted to mention also, just to back up a little bit, the Peru Turnpike. And a lot of folks, if you have connections with the Historical Society, probably know about the Peru Turnpike, because I know Sean has talked about it some and has some records of it. But it's such a part of our family because of our roots in Peru and then coming to Manchester. And the Peru Turnpike was a toll road that went between Manchester and Peru. And so it was used by our family a lot in those days. And the road was steep, and it was not a very good road. It was owned by a corporation that charged a toll to use it, and the corporation wasn't always very in good shape financially, and a couple of times the road went into disrepair and then got a new life and upgraded and so forth. But so my family in the earlier days traveled that road, and my grandfather Will had a bad accident with a team of horses on that road once. In the early days of cars, he met a car on the road and it spooked the team, and they took off, and I guess it wrecked the wagon, and I don't remember what else happened. But so I just wanted to make mention of that. Regarding Roger Hurley, my grandfather on Mom's side, she told how he came to be in Manchester. And he was a sportsman. He was a member of the Rod and Gun Club here in town, and he worked at the Journal office from the time he was in high school, and eventually became a part owner of the Manchester Journal. He worked there until he retired in the 60s. I didn't care for the horses much, so I like the woods, and so I kind of came together with my grandfather because of that, because he was a hunter and a fisherman, and he liked the woods. From an early age, when he came to Manchester, he got to know folks who had similar interests. And they spent a lot of time on what we call the East Mountain up here. And the East Mountain is an area that probably, let's say, is bordered on the west by the valley here, and on the north by Route 30, and on the east by the Winhall River, and goes south kind of indefinitely to the Kelly Stand Road. And it's got a lot of history, which I'm going to touch on. I'm not going to get into much detail. It's kind of a very large plateau and probably covers about 35,000 acres or so. And has a lot of logging history, and a lot of folks from Manchester that were sportsmen and hunters spent a lot of time up there, including my grandfather. And the earliest knowledge I know of that kind of pastime and era was, there's a picture actually up in deer camp called Daybrook Camp, it's there now, of my grandparents and a bunch of other young folks in a camp up there that was taken in the 1920s. And whether it was before or after my grandmother and grandfather got married, I'm not sure, but it was in that era. And that camp was probably a logging camp from the Rich Lumber Company, which operated in the 19-teens. And that camp wasn't used for logging in the 20s, but it was still there. So a bunch of folks from Manchester kind of went up there and took it over as a hunting camp. That included a lot of people that some people might know, Maynard Carlisle, who had a garage right over here, close by, and Ken Reed, who had Reed's Drugstore, and the Sweezies, who had Sweezy Lumber Company down here where Miles is now, and who else? The Campneys, and I want to talk about the Campneys a little bit. Frank Campney had a farm up where Gurry's was, now it's Bistro Henri Restaurant on Route 30, and that was their farm there. I think his father originally had that farm. And so there are a lot of local folks that originally used that camp from the 1920s forward to about 1950. And in 1950, or thereabouts, they moved, probably the camp was falling down, I don't know. And they built a new camp on what was Squeezy Lumber Company land. And that camp is still there today. There were 10 original owners, of which my grandfather was one of them. And they had a formal charter on how the ownership was passed on and so forth. And that camp still exists today. I don't go as much as I used to, but for about 45 years I spent a lot of time up there. And my grandfather introduced me to that and started me hunting. And I'll just mention that my grandfather he spent a lot of time in the woods, and he was an excellent shooter and an excellent hunter. He was a good enough shot that he hunted with a very light caliber rifle, and he always shot deer in the neck, whether they were running or standing, because he said with a light rifle that's the best place to hit them, and he virtually never missed. He was an excellent shot, and but he didn't always pay much attention to where he went in the woods, and he didn't put much care. And he often came back from hunting well after dark, so he didn't pay much attention to time either. And all the guys in camp always worried about him and so forth. And then when I started hunting, I was kind of the same way. And they tell me that when I didn't come back till after dark, my grandfather would be pacing in the camp, and where is that boy? And, you know, why isn't he back here? And everybody in camp say, see? But there's just one story I have to relate that has to do with that, and it kind of tells a lot about my grandfather, because probably nobody else would have admitted this when he came back to camp. But he went out hunting one day, and he hunted for a few hours, and then he had to do some business. So he, got his pants down and was doing his thing, and he looked out through the woods, and there was a building right there. And he said, gosh, I never knew there was another camp out here. And then he goes, oh my gosh, that's our own camp. But the funniest part was that he came back and told the story. And he was a little bit of a jokester and a goofball. And one other thing that I'll just relate is he wasn't much of a drinker. He usually didn't drink much, but the other guys would sneak vodka or gin or something into his drinks in camp. And they thought it was a big joke and so forth, but he always knew it, actually, and he played along with it. And so he had the last laugh in the end, because those guys didn't think I knew that they were doing that. But I want to back up a little bit and just tell a little bit of the history about the mountain, because it relates to some other things I want to mention. But I'm not going to get into much detail because there's way too much to talk about. I don't know how we're doing time-wise.
It's about 10 after 11.
Okay. So the earliest history of that East Mountain that I know about is what's called Rooteville, which there is still the Rooteville Road that goes up the mountain past Prospect Rock and up onto the mountain. And Rooteville was an actual place. I don't know how many people lived there, but it was quite a way. It was about, I'm going to say about 3 miles from the bottom of the mountain up to Rooteville. And there's still clearings there. And people live there. There's a couple of apple trees there and so forth. And I think that the reason that Rooteville was there was because of the charcoal industry, which was big in about 1870 to 1890. And there's a lot of charcoal kilns around southern Vermont, and a lot of the forests were cut off to burn in the charcoal mills and make charcoal, which was used for iron smelting, and most of it went to Albany and the Mohawk Valley, where iron was smelted, or whatever they do with it. And anyway, there were 8 charcoal kilns nearby Rooteville, and I think that was pretty much why that was there. The kilns are still there. They've fallen down, of course, but there's huge rings of bricks where the kilns were, and it's still partially cleared there. I haven't been there for many years now, probably 30 years, but they're still there, and that was a pretty historical part of Manchester, actually. So that was the earliest. The next kind of, I think chronologically, the next thing that I know about was what's called the Dufresne job. And there are quite a few Dufresnes in Manchester, and I don't know the relationships and so forth. But that was a sawmill that was much further over toward Stratton Pond. And that sawmill operated, I'm going to guess, operated around the turn of the century, but I'm not positive on that. And and the road came back to Manchester and came down to Manchester, and the lumber came out as lumber from that mill. And there was actually a telephone line that went to that mill, and when I was younger, you could still find parts of the wire in various places. And the road to that mill is actually, it's mostly still there, and part of the Appalachian Trail follows it for a short ways. The next thing is Rich Lumber Company, and I'm not going to get into that because there's a lot of history about the Rich Lumber Company, but probably most everybody knows the mill was down in Ridgeville, and it was a sizable mill, and it only operated for, I think, about 6 or 7 years. And they built the railroad that went up through Liebherr Hollow, and had a lot of major lumber camps up there. And a lot of people here know the Rizzio family, and the Rizzios came here because of the Rich Lumber Company. And I think Daley Rizzio's father worked for the Rich Lumber Company, and I don't know if Daley actually worked for them, but when he was a youngster, he was in those logging camps up there. That's one of the connections that I wanted to talk about with the East Mountain and all of the local folks who spent a lot of time up there. And Daley Rizzio was one of the camp owners of the deer camp. Where was I going with that? The Rich Lumber Company only operated for a short time, and then the mill burned mysteriously about the time they went bankrupt. And then the railroad was taken out because that was about World War I time, and the rails, they pulled up all the rails to reuse the steel.
For the government.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, because it was in short supply at the time. There's a place up there called the Burning, and I wanted to mention that. I've never been there. I always wanted to go there, but I just have never made it there. I've flown over it. And the burning was due to a fire after the area was cut off by the Rich Lumber Company, and all the slash burned. Very hot fire because there's still a lot of cleared ground up there from the fire. But it turned into blueberries for a period of time, which often happens after a fire. And there was extensive blueberry fields up there. And there was a trail that went up to it. And a lot of people went up there and actually picked blueberries both commercially and for personal use. And I think the trail went up actually from Sunderland Borough. But I'm not sure about that. But Daley Rizzio used to talk about going up there blueberry picking in the earlier years. The next chronologically is the Cass Company. And the Cass Company had a mill in the same location as the Rich Lumber Company in the 1920s. And Daley Rizzio actually worked for the Cass Company in a logging camp up on the mountain. And I can't really describe easily where it is, but I could probably find it again, and I think I might be the only person that knows where that is. Because when I found it, what I found was about 30 or 40 bed springs and a bunch of stove parts and so forth. And when I went back to camp, I described it, and Daley said, well, that was the Cass Company camp. And when they cut up there, it was after the railroad was gone. It was further north than the Rich Lumber Company operation. And they brought the wood down by horses down to Richville. But I described it to Daley. He said, that's the Cass Company camp, and nobody else in camp had ever found that. And to my knowledge, I don't know of anybody that's ever found it since. There could be somebody, and I could probably find my way there, but I don't know if I could walk there at this point. It's pretty remote. So that's, and then to move on, the Squeezy Lumber Company. And the Squeezy Lumber Company, Christopher Squeezy the first had a mill up the Rooteville Road up on the mountain. And I don't know how the Squeezys came to be in Manchester, but that's the earliest knowledge I have. And that was the Chris Squeezy that a lot of us knew. Wait a minute, I got my numbers wrong. pretty sure, he might have been Christopher Sweezy II, because, and I'll get down the line here in a little bit, but they had an operation up there, and then later Chris Sweezy, who I think would be the third, who, Chris that Ted is thinking of probably, he had the mill where Miles Lumber Company is now. And that mill operated, I don't know the years that it operated, but the heyday for that mill was the 1950s and into the early 60s. And Sweezy Lumber Company owned a lot of land on the East Mountain at that time and did a lot of logging, and it was sawed at that mill down here. And Chris Sweezy, Chris Sweezy was one of the deer camp owners. That lumber was all brought by deuce and a half Army trucks down off the mountain, both down Rootville Road, Downers Glen, and Library College. They came down both ways, and they didn't use the railroad bed. There was a different road that still exists today that was the way that they brought the lumber out that way. And that road is actually the trail to Library Falls at this time. That was part of that road that was used by Sweezy Lumber Company to bring the logs out that way. Chris had a big operation. He had a lot of local men that worked both at the mill and in the woods. He employed a lot of people during that time period.
The largest employer in Manchester.
Yeah, I can believe it. I can believe it. And that brings me to the Campneys, the Campney family. And I mentioned Frank Campney before as one of the owners of the deer camp. And I don't know whether Frank actually worked logging on the mountain, but I know you're nodding yes? Yeah. I know his son did, Burton. And Burton and Ted worked together for years as carpenter. They both worked for my dad.
I worked 25 years with Frank, 25 years with Burton.
Okay. And Frank worked for my dad in later years for a little bit too. But in any event, their history is connected with the mountain because they worked up there and hunted up there and spent a lot of time up there. Frank's father was also named Burton, and I think he may have started out, he may have come from the Adirondacks, because I know he worked as a guide in the Adirondacks back around the turn of the century. And he may have come here in connection with logging. I'm not sure about that, but he was a legendary shot. He was known far and wide for his shooting skills. And that was the oldest Burton, or the oldest one that I know about.
Have you mentioned the Rod and Gun Club at all?
I mentioned that Roger was a member of it.
He was one of the original.
He was.
members, Yeah.
Frank?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, not Frank.
The older Burton?
My father, Roger.
Oh, Roger, yeah.
Roger was
Yeah.
very instrumental in getting the Rod and Gun Club started. And I have more story to tell about that.
Okay. So in any event, I mentioned that Frank, and I think maybe his father, had the farm up where, at the top of East Manchester, on Route 30 there. And one story that I'll tell that I always heard in camp was somebody had shot a bear up on the mountain, and they brought a horse up to pull the bear down. And the horse got spooked by the smell of the bear and took off and came all the way down the mountain to the farm. So I knew the next Burton, who was Frank's son, and then there's a next generation that's also Burton, who lives down in southern North Carolina now and is married to Sherilyn Fowler, who many of you might know. And then Terry Campney is that Burton's brother, and he still lives in town, I think. So that was the Campneys, and then I've talked a little bit about the Rizzios, and Daley Rizzio he was a real storyteller. He didn't hunt much by the time I was going to camp, but he told stories, and he told a lot of stories, and I listened to a lot of things, and I always wanted to take a tape recorder up and tape some things, and I wouldn't have told him because I would imagine he would have just clammed up and not said anything had he known. But I never did that, and I kind of regret it, but on the other hand, it's like I said, I like verbal storytelling, and I like passing it on that way, so I try to remember what I can. And then, you know, the Rizzio family passes on as well to Dick and Joe, who worked for my dad, Daley's two sons, and then they went out on their own in the building business, and they went to camp, as did Ted, yeah. And then Joe has a son, Joe, and Dick has, what, one or two sons? Two, yeah, who are still around the area.
One's around.
So I like the woods. I didn't have many social skills when I was growing up, so I kind of went and hid in the woods. And my grandfather took me under his wing and taught me how to hunt and fish, and took me to camp, and that's how I got interested in all that. But as soon as I could break away from my grandfather and go out on my own, I did. And my grandfather was still alive for about, I started going up there in 1966 at the age of 15. And my grandfather was alive for another 12 or 13 years after
He
that.
died in 1978.
78. And he actually died up there. I was with him when he died. It was the last day of deer season. So that's my history of my association with my grandfather and the East Mountain and a whole bunch of families that live in Manchester.
It ties together, doesn't it? Well, I wanted to tie something else together, and I hope this is all accurate. It's pretty much as I remember it when I was first married. Kevin's father, my husband Orrin, was in the legislature. He was on the Board of Selectmen for a long time, and then he went up to the legislature when King Reed LaFave passed away. And either he or my dad, Roger Hurley, who worked at the Journal office, got wind of the fact that the Manchester Fair Association was going to give up on having Manchester Fair. There didn't seem to be as much interest. People didn't want to bring their horses there for the horse races, and it just wasn't what it used to be. And there was an entrepreneur that wanted to buy all of the Manchester Fairgrounds and build little houses all over. Well, my father and my grandfather both had a fit. They said that just can't happen. My dad was a very close friend of Bartlett Arkell, who was a very wealthy man. He owned the Beach Nut Packing Company. And my dad used to take him fly fishing. And my dad said to him, "Why don't you buy the fairgrounds from the Manchester Fair Association? Because you could donate it to the Rod and Gun Club, which is a non-profit organization." So my dad talked him into it, and it was purchased, and he did give it to the Rod and Gun Club. And of course, they didn't want the whole thing. They had that nice building that's still there and still in use. And they said to Orrin, "Can you talk the town into buying a bulk of that property as a town park?" So Orrin went to work with all his buddies that he had there in the town office. And they did buy that piece of property and turned it into a recreation park that it is now, and named it in honor of Thompson.
Dana Thompson.
Dana Thompson, yeah, Dana Thompson Recreation Park. So that was how it was saved from development. I think that's well worth noting. Anyway, we better bring this to a close pretty soon. Ivan took over the management of the horse farm after his dad died in 1978. My husband died in March of '78, and my father died in November of '78. That was a very tough year. And of course, Ivan had 3 wonderful children, and one of them is here, Megan. And she has a sister, Vanessa, and a brother named Matthew, who's doing great work down at Hildene now. That's an ideal place for him to be working. He just loves that. And they think he's doing a great job. My oldest daughter and her husband were veterinarians, and Linda has retired now. And she's homeschooling a couple of her grandchildren, so it keeps her quite busy. And she's also teaching them to play the piano. And of course, music was always such an important part of all of our family. We all love to sing, even though my voice has gotten very scratchy. I just sing for my great-grandchildren now. But one of my great-grandsons, one of Megan's twins, who was 8 years old, decided this winter that he wanted to take piano lessons. So I said, well, I would love to show him how we get started with it. I started when I was 4. This will show you how Manchester has changed. We lived in the Adams house right there next to the funeral parlor. My piano teacher was Edith Shaw, who lived down on Bonnet Street. And I was 4 years old. My mother would give me my music bag and take me across Route 7, put me on the sidewalk, and from there I went by myself, down through the town, past the stores, turned down Bonnet Street, and my teacher lived on the other side of Bonnet Street, so she'd be watching out her window. When I arrived, she would come and help me across Route 30, which goes to Torrance. Can you imagine doing that with a 4-year-old? So things have changed considerably, but music has always been such a big part of our lives. And I'm so thrilled that Megan's 4 boys all sing the Star Spangled Banner in public. They're all very musical. And Evan's doing great with his piano lessons. When he first started, they did not have an instrument in their house for him to practice on. So Megan took a big piece of white paper and drew like 2 octaves of white piano keys on it. And he would come in and practice every day his fingering on a piece of paper. So we did get him a keyboard finally.
Much quieter than
I had to practice, and he's doing very well. So I just feel like my life has been totally blessed from all these events that have happened, and we've all stayed very close to our Christian faith, and I just find that next to my wonderful family, the thing I'm the most grateful for is being able to be a Christian in this country without having to worry about being in danger. And I was very fortunate back in the 80s. The Episcopal Diocese of Vermont had a 3-year study program similar to what you would learn if you went to a theological seminary. And I was able to go to Rutland for 3 years to take part in that program and got my certificate. I was very grateful for that. So the church and music have always, and family, have always been at the center of our lives. And I'm just very, very grateful that everything has happened the way it did.
Can I just add something about Grandma Beattie?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, well, Grandma Beattie, like Kevin said, was one of 17 children. And the dad was always a cattle dealer. So he bought a bunch of cattle up in Peru. She was 8 years old, and she and her brothers and sisters were taken up to Peru. Their mom, Grandma Bettie, drove a car and took them up there, and they walked behind the cattle all the way down through that pike road and everything near Strauss, all the way down through to Manchester from Peru. And she said Grandma stopped at the store and got them some candy, and they were all very happy. And kept them off people's property and everything else, and all the way down. I mean,
Well,
can you imagine that?
Kevin's dad did the same thing. We had 2 herds of beef cattle. One we kept in Barnumville, they were the white-faced ones. And then we had Black Angus and Charolais crosses down on the hard farm. And he wanted to bring the 75 or so head from the hard farm up to Barnumville for the winter so they could give them their hay all together. So they waited till the ground was frozen. And it was a Sunday morning, and I had to go play the organ at church. I was having a fit because I wanted to watch. Oh, the reason this was being done was because there was a gas shortage. And the only way we had to transport them from one farm to the other was in a 2-horse trailer. Well, it was 75 head of cattle, and it's a 12-mile round trip.
This is about 1973, the first gas shortage.
Yeah, well, that's when we had our cattle drive right through Manchester Depot, up the hill, there, up Barnumville Road. And by the time I got through church, I was anxious to get down and see where they were, so I headed down toward the hard farm. I didn't find them. They were already in Barnumville. When the cattle got started, they galloped a lot of the way. And that was picked up by the Associated Press and was in pictures of it in newspapers all over the country, a way to save gas. Does anybody else have any more questions? Should have asked you that a long time ago.
Where was the Peru Turnpike?
It went through Barnumville, or it went from Barnumville up past Tollgate Lodge.
Okay.
Mistral, I'm sorry.
Okay.
And that used to be known as Tollgate Lodge, because that's where the toll gate was.
Right, okay.
And it went up past, it's what's called, I think, Old Snow Valley Road. It went up that way and then came out onto where 11 and 30 is now.
In Peru.
So
Now at the top of the hill. Oh, by Snow Valley.
Well, we thank you all for coming.
I have one more
Snow
question.
Valley.
Oh, yeah.
It came out
Aside
on
from
Route
the families, which was all very interesting, thank you for being here. But my name is Linda, and I am a co-owner of the Casablanca Motel on Route 7A. So it's the cabin property. And you were talking a bit about Jameson Flats and some of your family coming from that area. Do either of you or anyone in the audience have any history on those cabins? I've been researching them, and I did get them back to Sunnyvale Cabins on the property next door to us, 1947. Do you have any recollections of those cabins prior to 1947?
that would be before my time. I might look old.
Ted, ask Ted.
Ask Ted. Hi, Ted.
Well, it's almost before my time, but Smiths had a diner there and so forth, and I wonder if they were involved in it. Only thing I can tell you about Jameson's Flats, excuse me, everybody used to try their car out.
Oh.
That was,
Do 100 miles.
no, I was other places.
Right where it always was.
Right where it always was. yeah.
Well, my grandfather Adams, quite often in the evening, he was a great walker. He loved to walk. And he would walk up to the Smith Diner up on Jameson Flats for a cup of coffee,
Right.
just before he went to bed.
Where was Jameson's Flats?
Yeah.
It's
It's start-
Route 7.
Starts
North.
just
7A.
up here and goes up past the town offices. That long straight clips.
May I ask about
Straight
Smith's Diner? Is that where the Aspen Motel is now?
I'm not sure.
I think I'm pretty confident that it is, so our cabins were a little further north.
In my previous life, my mother-in-law worked there, that's all I can tell you. Well, that's how, like Kevin telling you about how stories get stretched, but they're always good.
Right.
Well, thank
Yes.
you.
I just had one final comment too, is that Lauren and your daughters were huge, teaching many people how, young people how to ride horses. My sister.
Oh, yes.
There was a whole generation of kids that practically lived in that barn.
Kids love it, don't they? Well, thank you all for coming.